Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Woven Wings Live, where we bring you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. If you enjoy listening to us, please share our show with a friend, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and join our newsletter, which is linked in the show description, to follow along the journey. I'm your host, Gabe Crane. I'm joined as always by my co-host, Rahul Didwania. And today our episode is titled People and Plants, Connecting with Our Fellow Living Beings. And our guest is Ralph Steven, who's an herbalist and ethnobotanist dedicated to bringing people back into right relationship with the natural world. And I'm really excited for this episode today. We thought about more academic and extravagant titles to this episode that involved big words like the environment and the climate and ethnobotany. And we left all those out. We kept it really simple because that's what we picked up in our conversation with Ralph getting this prepped. People and plants, our connections with our fellow living beings, the simplicity and also the power and importance of the natural world. And before I pass it over to you, Rahul, and get your takes on this, I think one thing that I want to emphasize about this episode is what's embedded there in what I shared about the title, which is, I think when we start talking about the natural world, we are humans and we have our big functioning rational brains that are capable of all sorts of different analysis. But it's also a vehicle that kind of separates us from the natural world or makes us look at the world from a utility viewpoint in a sense of, okay, well, what sort of medicine or food can I get from this plant? Or even in the conversation around climate change and preserving our planet at this point, how can we accomplish the utility of still having a place to live or not destroying ourselves? And all of those takes are important, don't get me wrong, but they are, I think, a little bit different than the essence of what we're exploring here today, which is a deeper relationship that can unfold with the natural world, which contributes to a sense of spiritual development and a sense of deeper belonging in the world and a deeper sense of meaning. And so we're going to get a deep dive into that with Ralph today. But before we go further, Rahul, I'm just really curious to bring you in on this and stoked to be here with you again. What do you think about people and plants, this whole topic we're exploring today, and anything around what I've already shared?
Thanks as always, Gabe. As I was thinking about this episode, the first memory that actually came to mind for me was gardening with my dad in the backyard. He's a big just planter and steward of different fruits and vegetables and this and that in our in our home, and it just brought back memories of like being in that environment with him and the like. So shout out dad. And just the like peace and calm and sort of therapeutic nature just being around plants. And it got me thinking a little bit about my own journey where, yes, maybe I started there, but then, then moved to Berkeley. Berkeley is a famously green and biodiverse place, which I think also cultivated a connection with being, around plants and around nature. But then, there was a little bit of a hard turn. I moved to the concrete jungle of New York. And then even after that, when I came back to San Francisco, it was, I think I just was more connected with the urban environment and felt more like I was in a city. And only in the last couple of years, I mean, I guess this is part of the maturing process of we started to bring plants back into our lives. And this has been more in the context of having plants at home and, at the office, on our patio, that kind of a thing. And it's been really nice, and that's just the very first set of things that comes to mind. But I think the larger thing is just this idea that like being around nature, being around plants, going to Golden Gate Park, going up to hike somewhere, all those things. Like I feel like there's an effect on like my neurology, and just the and my nervous system, and it's just something that I feel, I haven't really been very deliberate about, and so I'm very much looking forward to talking about this concept more, this idea of connecting with plants and between people and plants, and using it as a launching pad for myself, to be more intentional about that relationship in my own life. Yeah, just a few thoughts as I was really noodling on this episode, and curious if that prompts anything for you, Gabe.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing all that, and especially going down memory lane and being there with your dad and doing all sorts of stuff in the yard. And it actually reminds me, I'm going to bring this up with Ralph as we introduce him and bring him on here. But, as for folks who listen to the show, we usually do a prep session with our guest before the episode. And we got to sit with Ralph, virtually yesterday, and we were talking about different things. And after we had that conversation, I had to go out or I have to, but I got to go out and cut the grass at our place here on Maui. And I just have to say, like, as a result of our conversation, my experience cutting the grass was very different. And I'll kind of describe it like this. I mean, Ralph mentioned this thing, and I think when I originally reached out to Ralph, there was this idea of plant spirits, which we'll talk about today, or this idea of being able to communicate or be in a dialogue of some sort with the plants or the spirit of the plants, or there being some sort of communication that's possible. And, I'm sure that for some people listening to this, that might seem really far out. For other people, maybe that seems very natural and obvious. I feel like I toggle between those two. And when I was, the first thing that happened is that when I went out with this grass cutter to cut the grass, I felt like all these, not just the grass, but all the different plants that were around there, the weeds, so to speak, were all like talking to me in different ways, like about whether I should cut them down or not, or to cut them down. And it was interesting because we came out of this great conversation with Ralph about, the animated natural world. We're going to get into that. And I was like, wow, it's like the sacredness, the sanctity of the grass and all these plants. And I want to be really careful as I go about this. And I felt this communication happening. It was really lovely. And then I fired up the cutter and I started, cutting stuff. And it was really interesting to watch the dialogue that was happening change as the process went on. And as I'm whacking, and like firing this machine and everything, this other voice, which I guess was maybe a little bit more cynical or also more practical, a little bit more like aggressive, was also there, of just like, okay, I know you guys are there and alive and I appreciate your perspective, but I have to cut the grass. Like we clear this out. And got to this point of looking at the plants and seeing as I'm cutting them that like I'm not killing the plants. They're getting like a haircut, basically. Like they're still alive. They're like their root system. And, I think that just gave me this sense of deeper awareness of the environment, like that I am interacting with living beings that if I tune into them have a desire or like a preference, or maybe it's just I manifest as a voice in my head. I think I'm having a conversation with myself, but also it feels like not something that's somehow beyond myself too. And so, all right, I may have just outed myself as a weirdo. So when you see me cutting the grass, but also I would, in the name of vulnerability, I bet if you're listening to this or that maybe you've had a similar experience at different point along the way, maybe on a hike or whatever it is. And so, Ralph, let me introduce you and bring you in and just ask you about this experience itself as a starting point of just like, what do you make of that? But let me just introduce Ralph. Ralph Steven is an herbalist and ethnobotanist, as I said, dedicated to bringing people back into right relationship with the natural world. His work is predominantly with the endless botanicals of Florida. He's living in South Florida. Ralph offers wellness consultations for people and land alike, calling upon the tropical plants and modalities he has studied for the last decade. And I know Ralph from work when we met down in South America, and I know that's also going back and forth and learning from the traditions of South America is also part of his work. Ralph, thank you so much for being on our show today. And it's great to be here with you. How are you?
I'm doing really good. Thank you guys for having me on. It's been wonderful listening to this back and forth between both of you. I'm excited about your lawnmower story. It's really great.
Yeah, well, so let's start there, because usually we actually have a briefer introduction to this, and I guess we kind of maybe put the cart before the ox, started talking and telling stories. But can you just offer your 2 cents on this? Like, what do you think about that? Am I getting ready to go to the loony bin because I'm talking to the plants, or how can I make sense of that? Yeah.
Yeah, no, great. So before we started the call, I was telling you I have a story related to that came to me also mowing the lawn. I was cutting the lawn for an elderly couple I take care of in West Palm, and while I was doing it, it's a acre, it's a lot, and it's like a lot of trees. There's a lot of wild plants there. It's kind of like a little jungle. I've been cultivating with them, and as I was mowing the lawn, I started to smell the different plants I was cutting, of which I'm familiar with. One of them is bitter melon, Cerasee. Another one is anamu, guinea henweed. And as I'm like smelling them, I started to laugh, thinking about like how most people don't enjoy cutting the lawn. And I had this like whole comic in my mind like play out that I still want to animate, of like a disgruntled, unhappy dad on like a Sunday morning mowing the lawn, but getting this like aromatic inhalation of incredibly strong botanical herbs unknowingly, and like the unconscious any like dysfunction in his organism totally taking place without him being conscious of it, all because he cuts the grass twice a week or once a month or whatever, so
Mm.
it was really funny. And I it was like this whole comedic insight to start a campaign about becoming a conscious lawn cutter, like a total joke, but all not, like, so I really find it hilarious that kind of stuff to happen to you. And also, the other side of that, I think I've only made one meme in my life, like personally. I was really inspired to make this, but you remember that movie Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, from when we were young? And like the
Yeah.
guy's like
Of
above the
course.
grass with the magnifying glass and like looking for his kids or
Hmm.
whatever. I like made that. I took a screenshot of that guy, and the text went something like, when you start to recognize all of the wild weeds in the grass, you don't want to step on them anymore, like you like
Mm.
literally don't want to ever cut them down, because you're like, no, wait, this is special. And like I went through a phase of that, of like never manicuring the lawn ever again, which, to my family's and friends' dismay, was not accepted. um, and so, yeah, I find myself understanding the toggling, if you will, between living in the world and then having this like profound experience that everything around you has a name, and a story. So yeah, the lawn.
Love, Ralph, to talk about that. What you just described, right, is that profound relationship or feeling with and connection to things around us. When we talk about this idea of being in relationship with plants, right? And I'm thinking of what Gabe said earlier. It's like, yeah, that might just sound like a crazy concept to many people. What do we mean? Like, what does it mean to have a name for the things around us, to be in relationship with plants, or to connect with plants that are around us? Like, what are we talking about here?
I feel like it comes down to being curious, and it's much like being in relationship with people, your friends and your family. Like, you get to know them, you get to learn of their histories, you get to learn where they came from, their origins, and what they do, how they are. Or then you start to notice, especially if you live with them, you really start to notice like the daily occurrences, right? And so every single day, my morning ritual, that's not anything more than just what it is, but I take my toothbrush and I go straight outside, from waking up out of bed outside. So I like notice and have this like track record of looking at all the plants every single morning. And doing that, you really start to learn, what they're up to, and if they're flowering, and how long that takes, who visits them in the morning. And there's a relationship there just through that, So for me, it can go as far as, or as simple as learning botanically about the plants. Like, there's a relationship in that, to like getting a lot deeper. So, it's varied and will depend upon each person, of course.
Ralph, I'm curious if you could take us into your own journey a little bit around this, to fill in gaps for folks. So, I mean, I know we introduced you, and I know from our conversation that you're basically cultivating this nursery in South Florida. You're doing consultations, health consultations based around herbalism, ethnobotany with individuals. You also do some nursery planting, landscaping work. And so your work's kind of taking in these different directions. There's spiritual dimensions to it. But how did you get started in this? And what was the journey that kind of took you to where you are? Because I think Obviously you and I have known each other for a long time, where I can understand that sense you're just kind of, okay, I wake up in the morning and I start to be in a relationship. I start to actually make this connection. But I know also there's been times in my life where that seems very foreign and far away. And this sense of a disconnect between, like, I mean, what are you talking about? Like I don't, so people are kind of at that starting point of like, how do you even initiate this process of getting into a relationship? I'm curious if you could just share a bit about your own experience with that to help.
It started when I was around 19 years old. It was like 2007. It started with illness, which is somewhat comes to things like this, I think, at least from what I've seen. I received a tetanus shot for stepping on a nail. It went through my foot as I was at work. And from that, fell very ill with Guillain-Barré, which is a demyelinating nerve disease that ascends from the feet and usually reaches the head and renders the person paralyzed. So I was in Bethesda Hospital in Boynton for 48 days, and I probably should have been there for months, but my insurance stopped covering me, which was a wild Western medical story in and of itself. And I went home at 19 with a $1 million hospital bill and learned how to walk again at home. So that was like a giant seed with a lot of bitterness, pain, and agony and all kinds of other things. But in that experience, I was at that time desperate to understand something different, about how to work with people in that way. And so that led me to first to cannabis, believe it or not, to work with the pain management, right? And I had worked with that plant prior to that experience on a very minimal scale, like, very, very small amounts. And I met a friend who's like, oh, you've never worked with a blunt before? And I'm like, no, what's that? And it went from like, a handful of pills. Oh God, what are they called? Lyrica, Percocets. I was on Dilaudid. I was on morphine. I was on a whole mess of stuff. And I cold turkey stopped everything, which I don't recommend to do, by the way. And I went straight to that plant, and it kind of cradled me and held me for quite a while as I went through a very slow and arduous healing process. And so from there, I started to, and eventually through the skateboarding community, which I was deeply embedded in at that time, prior to that and after, I moved to Orlando from South Florida and lived in a house of a bunch of skateboarders. And in that house of skateboarders, the one who was running that whole friend organization was growing food on the side of the house and filtering rainwater with a carbon filter. And this was like, 2009 or so. And it blew my mind. And so from there, I started to get really involved with just learning about Orlando's flora. I met an herbal teacher there, and her and her home were very pivotal to my first steps, And then, it kind of, I got the bug, and it's never gone away. So through that process, it wasn't like an overnight thing. Sometimes I tell the story and people like equate that like I got very, very sick, and like a day later took a herb and then I was like totally better. No. It's been long of meeting things, along the way, meeting the people too that hold those things.
Thank you, Ralph, for sharing that. Yeah, it's fascinating just to hear like how it all started, and the unfolding of it. Feels very organic, to your story, or very authentic to the path that you had. And I think the question that's coming to me, and again, kind of thinking from the listener standpoint for a second, is like, why does this matter, right? Like we're talking about this. I think, I started out talking about, hey, like it felt my nervous system or whatever to be around plants. For you, there was the genesis of it was a very specific intervention, and then it's obviously grown from there. But just curious if from a broad standpoint, right, like what's important for us to understand as it relates to connecting with plants and having that relationship in our lives, as opposed to, hey, I already have my relationship with my people and the people that are in my lives, and yeah, sure, plants are around, but I don't really need that. Like what is it, that attitude, from this picture?
One thing, I've met a lot of people that may or may not be like in this world, let's say. And those are my favorite kind of people, because within a few minutes, they are all of a sudden like, wow, what? And that's, it's so common, people on the street walking by the garden I've worked at. I've always said like, I can to a plant person, because it's the understanding are so inseparable from our dependency on them, whether I'm talking about food, medicine, or even just like the shade that exists to help our AC bill be lower. The thing is too is that it's not for everyone. I don't think sharing is like this message that a person needs to become an herbalist or start growing plants. Although I think the world would be a better place if people did start doing that en masse, for sure. I think that there's many modalities to bring us into like what you were referencing, that nervous system reset, that calm, that baseline, that groundedness. Some people find it in different ways, which is amazing. For me personally, I feel like being in the garden, like literally physically being in someone's garden, my garden, does something to us. And so in a way of how the world's been going for some time, that may seem like something so simple that it's complex, so out there that it just doesn't make sense. But then you actually go and do it, and you notice something. You begin to notice something, and it's like very subtle at first, but then it's like, oh yeah, like this is very real, and I it's visceral. So I don't know if that answered where you were going with that or not, but
Okay, so I think Full is also, again, of thinking through this voice that I know I have internally, and I think Rahul, you voiced it here, which I keep, I guess there's different dimensions to it, but it's an egotistical voice, in the sense that it's kind of cut off from this. It feels kind of like protected or armored from this dimension we're kind of talking about. And yeah, I think when you're asking, Rahul, why does this matter, there's this idea that comes up for me that we've explored a lot on this show around relationships and embeddedness or interconnectedness. And we've explored that, a concept of woven wings, right? That to elevate our lives, to take flight, we have to weave our wings, and that comes from within ourselves, but it also comes from drawing on the relationships and the environment around us, other people. And here, I think there's this conversation about being embedded more deeply into not just the people in your life, but the environment, the beings that extend beyond that, and moving that, and that kind of gives us a sense of health. I guess, Ralph, if you have any comment on that, I want to invite. And I think alongside that, part of what I'm tracking right this moment is this kind of voice inside our heads, my head, the human head, which is that dismissiveness or this aloofness and avoidance of this sense of being embedded. And I think the element of like needing to make a distinction there, going back to the grass cutting example, it's like, well, yeah, I'm embedded with all of you guys, plant friends, but I still have to, I don't know, exert control or power. I must like cut the grass. I must define and design this area to be how I want it to be as a human. But yeah, nonetheless, there's this kind of embeddedness. And I think that when we have our arrogance or aloofness, one thing that comes up is like a characterization of this whole conversation we're having. Like, it's fun to make fun of hippies, right? If you can just label, Ralph, you're a hippie, so therefore, like this whole conversation is pointless or it's lacking in value, right? I think also, as we've lived through and watched different examples of this, dating back to the 60s, the 70s, like, it's kind of like the back to the land movement, or like this idea that like to be a plant person is to be kind of like a Luddite, or like to like be against, I don't know, technology or modernism or all this sort of stuff. So can you just help us disentangle that a little bit? How do we get past that? How do we acknowledge the realities, or some of the places where this approach could become maybe extreme or go off the rails, but also where we kind of get in our own way of actually establishing some of these relationships that could be nourishing to us?
Yeah, there's like 15 questions in there, but I'll try. So
yeah, sorry. Today I'm not like a good interviewer. Today I'm more of like a riffer.
I can riff.
Go in and yeah.
I'm gonna raff on your riff for sure. I'll try and Ralph it up. Yeah, there's so much going on. So let's see. I think that the whole making hippies things is hilarious. Hippie. I think what I was told a long time ago, probably by a hippie, is that hippie comes from hypocrite, from what I understand. in some way because they were like saying one thing and doing another. So I never aligned with that title. I never called myself that. I never was like, ha ha ha, like I love this peace and flowers kind of vibe. I like guns, like there's a lot of things I like enjoy that people are like, oh wow, you eat meat. It's like, what? Like there's so many preconceived notions about what someone that studies or works with or loves plants, that means that they do this and this and this. Like,
Mm.
it becomes this boxing in thing that humans end up doing regardless. So I joyfully and, without desire, shatter those sometimes for people, which is good. It kind of helps people understand it's like, it's not just like that. And yeah, the utility that from this whole thing for me and meeting so many different kinds of people. Like I always tell my partner Michelle, I'm like, it's really good to have different kinds of friends, and so in that way I can relate to every single type of person that I meet in my life through the lens that I've become immersed in, because of the fact that we have that world, you know and I feel like that is where it's like, yeah, there's no part of me that's like trying to run off and completely avoid living in the world. One of our teachers, Choki Nimir Rinpoche, he always would to always have one foot in this world and one foot in the other world, and so like to walk that balance of integration constantly. And I feel like so much value in that because I know that we had referenced living in South Florida at one point. This place can be difficult to navigate sometimes, and just like the actual place that it is. For anyone that may know of South Florida, I mean, everyone just thinks of Miami. Think of Miami a little north of where I'm at now. And I think in that way, this approach, this awareness is more needed in those places. And I know that you had, Rahul, you mentioned living in New York in like a concrete jungle. When I visit New York, of which also where I'm from, my family's from, I love going there because all of the northern herbs that I know of grow in the sidewalk cracks of New York City. So I'm constantly amazed that like, a Lyme disease medicine is growing in between these buildings in the middle of Brooklyn. And so it's like, there's this, it basically comes to worldview, for me, and shifting that worldview to being a little bit less dichotomous, a little bit less polarizing, and kind of melting that a little bit when we get to see how no matter who the person is, they walk the same things every, you know what I mean? Driving by through and into the same areas that I'm in. There's even a back entrance, to tell a little story. There's a back entrance here in this neighborhood I'm in, and it's been empty for decades. This huge lot, and open empty spaces in South Florida are very rare. It just doesn't happen. Usually they put up something, a building, whatever, apartment complex. And I've been going there the last few years, and I've actually been planting both native and a few non-native species into this completely invaded area of Brazilian pepper, carrot wood, and Napier grass, which are like three of the most intensely growing plants overtaking natural spaces. But they have a purpose, and I'll get into that. But I've been planting back there, and people are like watching me, and they're like, they probably think this guy's going into the woods to do something sketchy. So I always introduce myself to someone who pulls up with their dog, because they're like watching me carry 5-gallon buckets of lake water from this like random lake into the woods, and it just looks bad. Like I know what it looks like. It looks so bad. Like down cross on my back, there's like some rituals happening, in the dead rabbits hanging from poles. Who knows? But I'm just like, no, I'm actually planting trees so that we can, come over here and work in this way. And I start introducing them to all the plants and showing them everything, and they're just like, this is here? I never even knew these were here. I'm like, how long have you lived here? Like 30 years. I'm like, right. That's why I'm doing this. So it's not about like leaving the life you thought you had behind. For me, it's more about coming into the fact that you have access and an awareness to these things in your kitchen, at your doorstep, and in behind. That's kind of my mission, is like getting people to wake up where they are. You know what I'm saying? If that makes sense or hits.
Image with you and seeing you walk by. And when we talked earlier, right, I really resonated with this idea that you've alluded to of knowing your surroundings, right? Knowing where you are, being connected to it. Even that piece you mentioned around noticing something growing in a crack in the sidewalk. Like we have a small terrace in our apartment, and there's this plant that's just grown a place that I never thought it was even possible, and it's gotten really big as we just didn't go out there much over the winter. And there was this curiosity that I noticed within myself when I saw it. And then I saw it and kind of acknowledged it, to my wife, and that was that, and didn't do much more with it. But but what I'm hearing from you is very genuine curiosity and then action that follows that, as far as connecting to what's around you, and that flows from a world view. This stuff is important, and that all makes a lot of sense, to me, as I just kind of take it in. And I'd love to go a little bit deeper on that. So I think, you've heard me ask already, like, why does this matter? It's like taking that a step further. What's important about understanding what's around us? I think part of me is ready to take it at face value. Like, yes, of course, I should know the area around me. I'm thinking of a very different example where it's like, went to a friend's apartment. I was like, hey, is there parking around there? And he's like, I don't know, because I have a parking spot and I haven't noticed, if there's parking around us, because I go straight to my spot. And just, it's interesting. So there's a part of me that's like, yeah, of course you should just know. But what is important about connecting with our surroundings?
There's a few pieces that come from me. One is a sense of purpose, which largely can be said to be missing when we look out into the world at large. For me, it's almost like a geolocation of ourselves, the aspect too that it's important on a real way, listens that, like, someone gets sick, I know where to go. I know what trees to pick from. I know what herbs to pick from this land. I know which one of my friends have those plants growing in their yard who let me come in and harvest. So it's like some real world value there, And then in like a more zoomed out way, yeah, like the purpose of knowing your land and knowing the things that go around you, it kind of speaks to something that's hard for me to put into words. Yeah, it's like the word, the geolocation is what's coming to me, but it's like, your relatives, you're asking the question. And, some of these questions, when I was reading through the email, I was thinking about someone like 1,000 years ago hearing these questions and just being like, what happened? Like, what do you mean? Why they ask you why it's important to know where you live? And I'm like, things have gotten real bad, man. Sometimes I think about that. My aunt's like, damn, bro, we're going to send you some angels. You need help, boy. Those are my non-existent Louisiana ancestors. But yeah, so I don't know if I hit on that a little bit.
And I think just one point to bring out is, I know you specifically had made this comment also when we chatted earlier, of like, you can only protect what you know. Mm-hmm. And would love to hear you just elaborate on that concept for a second.
Yeah. And I was thinking about, after I said that with you, the line that came to me is actually, you can only protect what you love. And so I'm showing the people when I give classes or plant walks, it's like, they always tell me at the end, it's like, you really love this stuff. I'm like, yeah, I know. Like, it really helped me, and it really continues to help me and help people that I know. And so you start to love those things, those tools in your toolbox that have been so dependable, And so in getting to love them and getting to know them, much like courting your partner, you start to get to know them, you start to fall in love. You can protect them because you know them. You know who they are. You know what they look like. What belongs, And you also know, when you come to know these relationships with the plants, their histories and their origins, where they come from, and what purposes they have. It's quite a complex and wild world when you get into that. It can get pretty polarized. And once again, I like to be a disruptor in that realm when people start talking about invasive and non-invasive, which really can also be transposed into the human realm. We talk about, the intense dialogue of colonization and all these things that come up for people. The same thing happens in the plant communities, and the nuance that sometimes I see, or a lot of times I see largely missing there, is that all of these things and all these people have place, and they have reason, and they have stories, and so it's not as simple as the black and whiteness that's so easy to paint upon them. So yeah, I like to bring that in too, so we get to start to know and protect what's around us. A lot of the times that gets mistranslated to eliminate non-native plants, completely blast them out of the area, without considering the fact that they serve a function and occupy a niche in rehabilitation, oddly enough. So yeah, pretty wild.
Thanks for that, Ralph. I like where we're going in this conversation. I feel like it's like water is slowly seeping soil. That's kind of the image I get. And I will bring us back to, because I keep noticing it arise within myself. I want to bring us back to this idea of developing the relationship, or what it means to kind of cultivate the relationship outside of utility. And one of the, I mentioned this in the intro, one of the kind of impetuses for Ralph and I getting reconnected was I was reading this book by Elliot Cohen, Plant Spirit Medicine. And in there, this book is a few decades old at this point, but in there, the author talks about this process of connecting with the spirit of plants. Yes, for herbalism, yes, for healing, but I guess the approach he describes in there is less about making a tincture to in a more allopathic sense heal a particular illness, and more in the sense of developing a relationship, I guess, through your mind, through your intention, through that inner dialogue, spirit of the plants, and that creates the opportunity for a much sense of relationship or embeddedness in the environment. And I'm curious if you could elaborate on that a little bit. And yeah, just disentangling this idea of like, what are we extracting and making use of from our environment because it like helps us, and then what are we nourishing or cultivating this relationship, and a bit about how we do that. Like, how do we initiate that process?
Yeah. Yeah, I read that same book, like I was telling you, some years back, and it definitely had an impact on me. I was already in that framework, so to speak, so he kind of helped illuminate what was kind of already taking place. But the basic essence from what I can distill of that is that in the animistic worldview, right, that everything has a spirit, everything is alive, the plants being largely, of course, included in that. And you come to encounter all the world global cultures pre the spread of, the quote unquote Judeo-Christian movements, knew this and totally participated. And so where that's still alive and where I encountered that was absolutely in South America, working in Quitos and the Andes of Peru, but also first in Florida, working with an herbalist who was showing that aspect and the most simple of ways in connecting with that energy, which seems to be perceived by the heart, like it's been proven over and over again, the right of the heart. It literally is, there's an electric component to our being. And so that electricity is all around us. It's easily visible with these simple devices. And so the frequencies put out by these plants are by the heart. And so one of the simplest practices is just called, I think they call it a sit spot, where you just literally sit next to a plant. You sit next to a plant, and some people will say that you can make an offering of whatever may come to you. It can be a little bit of water, it can be some tobacco, it can be whatever is sacred to you, in a good way. And you make an offering to that plant and ask permission to, connect with it. And you sit there and is in the stillness and quietness that you can enter into, and something will come to you. And we did this in a class format a number of times in a group of about 20 people. And it was amazing how many of the experiences lined up. And there was like this thread of continuity and synchronicity when people would sit with the same plant and not communicate those two people beforehand or after, and then in group settings share, and then the sharing would be like, wow, that's what happened to me. And so we're like, yeah, I got this. And it was pretty wild. That was like my introduction to all of that. And so that spiritual aspect, these plants have, the way it was taught me is that they have spirits, they have guardians, that are there. They are there, they are present, and it makes you believe, given the upbringing that we've all had. But when you're in a place where that's a part of their cosmology, and it's something that is as natural as, that as in the sky, they're like, the children all know, the adults know, the teenagers know, the grandparents know, and they have it fully installed in their entire culture that this is real. Whether or not some of them, have actively started to move away from that or not is another story, but it's still so common that you can talk about it to almost anyone in those areas, and they're like, yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, for me, I have this one story, and they keep going on about it. Why would one want to do that? Let's see, the guidance that can come from that, I think, is incredible. And just knowing that there's something more offers a sort of purpose in the hope of extending beyond the materialism, which seems to have brought humanity into a really strange position in my mind. kind of coming back to that line of you can protect what you love. And when you start to recognize that, these massive 1,000-year-old trees have a guardian spirit that lives in them, there's something else going on to, maybe wanting to keep those around because they have some wisdom lived and they've seen a lot, being around for so long on the earth. Yeah, I don't know if you wanted me to share
Yeah, I mean,
more. What
no,
do you
I mean,
think?
this is really great, Ralph. I mean, it is that point you made much earlier, right? About talking to someone from 1,000 years ago is still a point I'm thinking about where it's fascinating, right? To think that for the majority, even of human history, right, going back tens of thousands of years, I mean, 1,000 certainly, but even before that, some version of what you just said was, as far as we know, was embedded in that we operated, as a species and as a local tribe or a community or a people or whatever you want to call it. And to think that that's kind of just been lost, at least in there's where we grew up, not all over the world, or maybe we've just lost sight of it, is both interesting and kind of sad, and we tend to always look at what's hopeful. And so I think that's also here, right? That, hey, like we are starting to reconnect with that. I think even this conversation is a version of that. I'm even thinking of, a study or this article or something that I read about the like plant networks that are connected for miles on end, underground, and how initially even the interpretation of that was very rote and scientific and rooted just in like, oh, okay, this is what happened biologically. But then it actually opened the dialogue to this idea that like, hey, these plants, these trees, this network is actually looking out for other parts of the network. And yes, maybe you could trace it to releasing some sort of chemical to signal some that there's a fire happening on one end to the other. But that it's like, hey, you could arguably reduce all of human activity to that too. And I think what it is actually, for me, I remember when I learned about that, it opened me up to this idea of like, oh, whoa, there's something more here. And also was thinking as you were talking about all this about, funnily enough, about Avatar. It's like funny to think that like Avatar trying to capture some version, of this concept and leading into, I think, some of the worldviews, that are available to us, and actually creating a visual for it, I think is a really cool way to open up all these concepts as well. Some of that was just reflection, but I think the question that I wanted to ask you is, as you were talking about these insights, right, or these, the insights coming from the God spirit, I'd love to hear a little bit about your own experience with that. What are some moments, or some examples of experiences that you've had, just to continue to bring that to life even further?
Yeah, this is where it gets juicy. I was thinking about this because I saw that question coming up, and I started to think. I was talking to my partner about it, and there's a few key ones that are just like incredible. And even actually today, I'll speak to what happened today, because it's really like quote unquote plant communication, but to me, it depends on how you look at it. I was actually selling a bunch of plants to a gentleman that messaged me off Etsy. I have a little, plant shop on there, and he reached out to me for a bunch of cuttings of cassava, of which I have a bunch of varieties going and steward. And I really like this guy. He's an older guy from Jamaica who's from New York, and he's Jamaican. And we just connect really good in this like Sam's Club parking lot. We just like have really long conversations about plants. And he has the bug. And like when I newly acquiring the bug, I love feeding that. Like I fertilize it heavy. So like I spend way too much time with him in this parking lot for like what I have to go do in the day. So I was there, and before I left the house and bringing all these cuttings, I saw this one plant in a bin that I'm just about ready to plant out all of them. It's called a purple yam, but the actual it's called ube, UBE. If you Google that, you'll see all the ice creams they make from it. I think you might be familiar with it, Gabe. It's a really incredible. It's a really incredible vegetable. It's a potato, but everyone mistakenly thinks it is. It's a whole different genus. So I grabbed one, a little like 4-inch pot of it, really nice, rooting and shooting out, and I threw it in the bin. And I see him in the parking lot. I pull out the box of cuttings, and I'm like, hey, here's the cuttings you ordered, and I also am bringing you this special plant that I think you would like, because he's really into security and like, securing the house for what may come and all this. I give it to him and I'm telling him about it a little bit. And then at the end of the, hour in the parking lot, he's like, hey, one more question, after I said bye to him like 20 minutes earlier. He's like, one more question. I'm like, yeah. He's like, have you heard of this plant? He's like, they call it like, the purple yam. And I was like, what? I'm like, that's the plant I just gave you. And he's like, no way. And he starts freaking out, like hands on head, like very New York, which I relate to. And he's like, pulls out his phone, and he had a phone note in his phone notes from yesterday where his Filipino friend, his therapist, I believe, his physical therapist, was telling him to grow this plant that I gave him this morning, of the hundreds of plants that I could have picked, So things like that happen to me every day. And it's like, I guess I was thinking today, I'm like, what can I tell them about? And it's like, sure, that can be classified like as a simple coincidence, but it's like, when I start to tune in over the last years into this like language of like how the nature starts to speak through people, it's undeniable. That's one. And then going back into more of like the plant spirit communication directly, there's this was 15 or 16, I believe, that I was dating a doula, and I was giving consultation to one of her clients who had depression. And so I was on the way to this person's house, who was like maybe a 30-minute drive from where I was living. I'd never been in that area of Orlando before at this point. And I'm driving, and I look out to my left, just so happened to see this pink flower. And knock on all wood that I'm like always looking at plants while I'm driving. I don't recommend people do that, but it happens. And so like I'm seeing this pink flower to the corner of my eye as I'm on the way to a consult, and I made a U-turn and I stopped and checked it out. And like I got out of the car, and it's this beautiful tree, and I'm looking at it. I'm like, God, is this albizia? And I'd never even seen this tree called albizia before. I'd never seen it in real life. Maybe I saw a picture of it years prior, but I was like, this is albizia. I just knew it in my being that this was albizia julibris, the tree of happiness, it translates to from Chinese. So I'm smelling the flowers. I Google it on my phone, and I'm like looking at the flowers. I'm like, this is it. And I got it verified for sure. But I end up going there after the client, and I had told her, like, I found a tree that they use to clinically treat depression that you may want to check out on the way to your house that I'd never seen before in my life. They're like, what? I'm like, I'll write it down for you, And so I was like, that was insane. And I went back there, harvested bark and flowers, and I still have about a half gallon of that going. It's a very potent medicine. It's a wild invasive that people hate to death, from Central Florida north to North Carolina, west to Texas. But if they learned how to use it in the right way, maybe it would help out the world in some sense. I think that's one. And then another one to maybe close this up, because I could go for a while. Let's see. Yeah, plant spirit. Okay, I'll tell two. I had a dream, and the dreaming energy, they would say, I would say, is directly connected in the same realm, that the plants occupy, in the plant consciousness. I know this is going way deep for some people, but they can speak through the dream state, So like when we go to sleep, and arguably we have dreams. And so in that space, I had a dream where I received a letter from my Peruvian teacher. And in that letter, he told me I had to come and diet or work with a plant called Shiri Sanango, Brunsfelsia grandiflora. And it was like an urgent message in the dream. Like I woke up crying, like kind of confused as to why. I was crying. I had a really strong dream going on. It was like super, you wake up dreams from like very visceral. And so I start to discover that, and I end up going to the jungle soon thereafter to diet that plant, and not really knowing much about it, And it comes to be, I come to learn that plants, keep in mind, this is at that point, it was some years after my Guillain-Barré syndrome, had been in my body. So in that diet, working with that plant for the first time and the second and third time, one of those days working with it, it brought out of my body, like I started to viscerally experience the tastes, the smells, the morphine being injected in my arm. I could feel the hospital room as if I was in it. And keep in mind, I'm in the tropical Amazon. The cold air of the AC blowing on me. I could feel the hospital bed. It was insane. And I was completely sober. I had just drank like this much of this infusion of this root of this plant. And so I started to tell my teacher some hours later, after I wept my eyes out, that all those things were happening to me. And he's like, it's pulling the memories of the trauma out of your bones. And so I was like, okay, like this plant was good to do and work with. Like, and it was calling on me in a dream while I was in Orlando, thousands of miles away. So it's like,
Wow.
there's stories like this that go on and on and on. And if these are, personal to me and mine, his stories that he's shared with me and his wife's stories that they share with me that happen to them all the time are just beyond words. And so I've actually begun collecting them and putting them together. It's a process going to take me a long time, but I've been pairing those stories with imagery that I've been shooting down there on film to kind of like, tell the story of a little bit of those experiences to people. So a little bit of an answer.
Thanks, Ralph. I mean, all that is so rich, and I can personally resonate and relate to that in a whole host of my own experiences in different ways. Sometimes connected with plants, sometimes not. And the part that really sticks out to me, I've emphasized this a couple of times, but I feel like it's so crucial to what we're exploring here is this sense of the network and the embeddedness, and then the communication, the transfer of energy, information, the communication that across different beings or entities to make something happen. As like what you were describing, Rahul, about what we've been learning about different plant species, about how they are a stand of aspens. It looks like a bunch of different trees. It's one organism, and then that organism is in communication with other entities and beings within that ecosystem. And all told, the network kind of manifests life, or it manifests vibrancy. And we talk about that on our show, right? Wisdom and Tools, Vibrant Living. And I think a big part of what we're exploring here is like, well, what is the vibrancy that comes from being really hooked into our networks, which include not just our people networks, but the plants. And really, I mean, we're talking about plants today. Ralph, you probably agree, right? It's the plants, it's the geology, it's the mycelium, it's like actually all these different layers of the ecology, which is part of us in that sense. It's actually not separate from us. We tend to think of ourselves as humans as this kind of egoic, separate entity, and there's some reality to that. But when we lean too much into that, then we get it from the broader world, which we rely on. So I guess I have a question about, there's a question that goes down kind of what's about that. But before we go there, I would really like to hear you just share a little bit more about your teacher from South America. You mentioned him just now, and this you've been going down to South America and visiting, learning from, and gaining these stories and insight from. And I guess I'm just curious if you could describe what's been nourishing to you about that relationship. And I know that you're now in the process of bringing other people or helping others to get introduced to him, his family, his way of life, his teachings. And just curious if you could share, what's nourished you personally and inspired you to make that part of work and the life you're living.
Yeah, his name is Don Luis Pinedo, and his wife is Sarai Pinedo. And he's Huitoto, Peruvian, which is originally a people from southern Colombia in the Amazon, in that area. And they escaped to parts of Peru, escaping the rubber barons in those years. So there's a whole community outside of Iquitos of mostly Huitoto people that came generations ago to that area. And Sarai is Yawa, and so she's native Peruvian for as much as I know from that area. And I met them years ago, maybe it was 2013 or so. I started to connect with Don Luis in the ceremony space. And I felt something about his way of carrying himself that was just it was so inspiring and attractive to me, after having had encountered at that time different teachers, and just like the simplicity of the way he carried himself, and like this total lack of, what's the word I'm looking for? He knew who he was, in the sense that he wasn't trying to show me something else or bigger. He was very much like just him, a humble man, and I was so drawn to that as like a real human being. And I was like, he's got something, like he's got his finger on something I really am curious about. And so after meeting him, I finally got the chance to diet with him for the first time in 2014. And then after that dream that I just mentioned prior, I returned back to his land in 2017 to continue dieting after that initial one. And so, yeah, what's been nourishing about getting to know him and his family, his wife, has been really just seeing like this other way of life that I wasn't raised in, you know, like I didn't camp outside of nature till I was like 25, you know, a late bloomer in every way, in every sense of the word. And so getting to be in community and relationship with Luisa and Sarah, and seeing him with his kids, his grandkids, and his great grandkids, he's 55. Can you imagine life over there? It's amazing. I'm walking around with his grandkids, you know, someone was old when I first met him, and he's like telling me about all the medicines, you know, and he's like, did you know that I remember him, he came to my hut one day. I actually have a recording of him telling this because I knew some juice was about to come out. And he's like, did you know that God gave us the coca plant for healing? And I was like, wow, who told you that? He's like, my grandpa, Luis. And I'm like, oh my God, like this is everything, you know, like witnessing the generational pass down of wisdom, witnessing the cultivation of the healing path being integrated into their lives, you know, like to them is something that they do when they need help, you know, or when they need to cleanse and come back to center. And it's not something that's like, how to explain, like we've made something super, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of over glorified it in this way, in this world, you know, out here. And for right reason, I understand where that comes from having absolutely none of it and no wherewithal whatsoever. It becomes deified in a way, you know, and kind of lose its context. And so being with it in full context with them down there really helped me kind of ground into how it all works, you know, from them hunting and living off the land in a real way to them, yeah, being real humans, you know, and having the dynamics of living in a pueblo and our that can happen down there. All of that has been to me in seeing how real people live, you know, and bringing that back home to Florida has been huge for me. Is bringing back home to Florida the things that I've learned in the Amazon have been so translatable here. I've told people for so long that the Florida that we know in South Florida is the northernmost reach of the Amazon. And I mean that in a botanical sense. And through that, then we can nourish and cultivate the things that I feel like the people of Florida were cultivating a long time ago. Although finding evidence of that is very difficult. I feel like a lot of the plants that existed in the Caribbean and in northern South America, all the way down to where I go, were here for sure. And there are people that agree with me that have a lot of experience. So yeah, I feel like it helps me indigenize, if you will, to where I live, you know, to become a citizen, to become a human of the world that we actually live in, you know, to become a citizen. So it's helped me to really nourish that, which is huge.
Yeah, and everything you're speaking to here, Ralph. I mean, it we use the word spiritual practice, you know, all that's about how that we can do, you know, when we come in with intentionality, we come in with a spirit of connectedness, understanding, curiosity, you know, and so on and so forth. They're all part of creating nourishment for ourselves and love. You know, I think you mentioned love earlier, and I heard a lot of love in the way you were talking about your teacher and you know his family and the way of life that and even you know, the mission that you are now a part of, as far as bringing some of that understanding and that beauty into your own local environment. And I think, yeah, it's just it's really great to just hear and picture and imagine all of that. You know, wonder. I'm just curious if there's a way you would talk about it that makes it as to how of this is connected to a spiritual discipline. You know, because I think that's how I'm interpreting it in the way that you're talking about it. But I'm curious if that resonates with you, you know, or if you can the bridge between how having a connection with plants, having a connection with our environment, you know, all the different things we've been talking about plays into a brand of spirituality and spiritual growth and spiritual nourishment.
Yeah, I feel like it all boils down to informing right relationship, you know, like how to be alive, you know, how to be here we encounter. And so it's directly shown to me by what I witnessed down there. It's shown to me by my own family relationships, which are very real, as I imagine you both have. And bringing that back home and practicing, it's really that practicing. So for me, like, after going through the gamut of a few different spiritual traditions in the last years, I think I've pulled back away from a lot of those. And there's some stories about that, but I mostly am just in this kind of, yeah, I guess it's like I haven't even analyzed it in a long time or thought about it. It's like my spirituality is life, it's living, I work with those sacred plants, I work with those medicines, but I feel like the call to box in and to title so much of it sometimes take the fact that I think it's just very basic and very human to learn how to be here in a good way. And so all of what I'm talking about and all of what I feel like has happened through me and for me and with me has helped me be a better partner to my sweetheart, to a better son to my parents, a brother to my siblings, a better neighbor to the people right next to me who I'm sharing Wi-Fi with. I'm just kidding. And so, yeah, like, I feel like for me, I tell this to my partner a lot, because we both were investigating some of the stranger sides of the COVID stories, which I'm sure touched strings a little bit in your worlds. And I told her one day, I was like, listen, at the end of the day, if the things we're touching on and reading on and consuming don't help us be better people, I don't care. I don't care. And I had to shave away a lot of bullshit, excuse my French, but like, that's what I feel like Don Luis has told me, like, a lot of this work with the plants is honing. A lot of it is just like, he's like, a lot of it is letting go and shaving down to an essence of like what actually works for you and what you are, and like, there's so much that we accrue and accumulate. And so it's like that process of purification and honing in the fire, or like forming on the wheel, if you will. That is the spiritual discipline, becoming who we are.
Towards the end of our time, Ralph, but I really appreciated what you just shared there. And I want to invite one question at least that goes a little bit further down that path. Shaving down to an essence, or also letting go of what, you emphasize what works, letting go of what doesn't work. And, you mentioned something really interesting when we were prepping this episode. You mentioned that nearly every person, or maybe every person you met who's seriously on this plant path, as you said, has had a challenging experience or initiation with someone who's been difficult for them, or they've faced challenge in facing this. And, I think it probably relates in some way with these kind of qualities of the human ego and this way that humans do something that, maybe plants also have egos. I don't know, or that, they're jockeying for power and control in the way that humans are. But I also there's something unique and particular to the way that humans do that. And I'm just curious if you could just share a little bit around, like, what have you seen as being valuable for yourself, or in maybe some of the examples of reflections around you, people around you, of like what's helpful to get shaved down in order for us to be able to have this essential relationship. What has to go?
Great question, Gabe. That was fantastic. Your podcast is going to do very well. A plant message just came through. The plant communication just came through. Hold on. Yeah, solid. Oh, I thought you were really ethereal music in the background, but that might have been a car passing. I was like, wow, that was really good. That was live. Okay, so in the shaving down experience with the encountering of the clowns that maybe we encounter, give them a sweet name, they will bring up. So yeah, like I was saying to you prior, I met every single person that I've met, and that I can think of right now at least, has met that person that showed them the way not to do it. That's what I usually say. It's like, and that to me is the greatest teaching. It's one of the greatest teachings, is to be shown like, oh, that's not where to go, actually. And like, you give great gratitude for the blessing that you received inadvertently. And, that wasn't the intention of the person, obviously, but it's what you got from it. And so that's one. And then the shaving part, I feel like in my experience over the years, it's been letting go of the heaviness around judgment and shame, these like heavy, dense emotions that literally hold us down, and it's been something that's been escalating for me in the last few months, like really kind of taking a really incredible journey in rising out of that. And in which, like, I had thought I had done a lot of work around that. And, there's those lines about like, it's not, healing isn't linear and all this kind of stuff we hear, but it's very, very true. And so I felt like I had been spiraling closer into an of like finding roots of things that I had not paid enough attention to, revolving around, maybe, yeah, like self-valuing programs that had been installed in me by those beings that I considered to be teachers, and really had so deeply. I mean, I wasn't even aware that they were there. And so I recently had a dear friend and teacher on the path to kind of like of that and be like, he's like, do you see that? I'm like, whoa, okay, this is good. This is good. I need this, And so in letting go and honing in, that's one aspect. And I think even another for me personally, in the world of like working with the earth and with all these good things, it's so easy to get to sign up for everything, you know. You want to homestead, you want to beekeep, you want to raise cows, you want to raise chickens, you want to you want to do absolutely everything, and like you haven't even raised a lettuce plant, or like walked outside in the last 6 years or anything like that, So it's like, for me, some of that letting go is just kind of like focusing in on just a few things of just a like very small amount of things to get down to the goodness of what those things are, and so, yeah, that's part of it too. And so just letting go of like the distractions, really, like even if they're good distractions, I always say that because I have a lot of good distractions. They're great, they're like fantastic distractions. Like I can spend a lot of them. And then at the end of the day, I'm like, I'm not really feeling fulfilled in that thing, even though it's like fantastic and it's going to help this and that. I can justify it 100 ways, but there's a part of my spirit that knows like, you're wasting your time, So I'm like, I got to listen to that. That's really important. And so, yeah, the diets and the plants and being in that way of life has helped me kind of hone in like what's actually for me, And that's basically it.
Well, Ralph, I want to thank you, just for joining us on this project and in this conversation. And, we'll use what you just said as a segue to one final question from my end, which is just, what is one takeaway, if we can even boil it down to one? I know we went across so many different things, but some sort of a takeaway that you might want to leave for our listeners, something that they can take back and maybe immediately start thinking about, or some sort of a small action that they could take. You mentioned cutting out the noise a little bit. Just curious if there's anything there that jumps out to you. But again, thank you for everything and for such a rich and expansive conversation here.
Yeah, you're welcome, and it was great to speak with you too and get to know you a little bit more, Raul. Yeah, one takeaway. Let's see. Maybe to practice curiosity. I feel like that's been so helpful for me in, especially like as an advice point for someone that's curious or desiring to get into the kind of like whole world of plants, and it can be so overwhelming about like which way to go. And so like seeing curiosity about just where you are. I have a teacher who would say to me, he's like, do you know 10 plants that grow around you? And I'm like, at that point, I was like, no, I don't know one, And so just that one question, to really get to start to know some of the relatives around us. That's one, I think, to be curious about who lives around you.
Thanks so much, Ralph. I mentioned this to Rahul after we talked in preparation for this episode, and I just told Rahul, I just really like talking to Ralph. I feel I just in his presence. I like kind of energy coming to him. I end up smiling and laughing, and this conversation has been just like an absolute expression of that, an extension. I just something in that to me is very meaningful. And I really appreciate that about you. I just want to acknowledge and honor that and just thank you. It's really, really nice to be in your presence. And to me suggests that like, whatever you've been up to, like in and out, like all the different steps along the way, I get the sense, knowing you for years, that it's really leading you somewhere valuable and helpful to others. It's been helpful to me today. And so thank that. And thanks for making the time to come on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been an honor to reconnect, Gabe. It's been years we've even spoken at all, so I'm really grateful to have us with you guys. And yeah, man, I love this idea of sharing and getting people inspired, and it's important for voices to be heard in this way. So, yeah, thank you guys.
Awesome. if you're listening to us, thank you so much. If you enjoy listening to us, please, again, share us with a friend, review wherever you listen to podcasts. And again, you can join our newsletter to follow along the journey. That's in our episode description below. You can also find it at wovenwings.net. And yeah, as we close out today, I just want to emphasize what Ralph's left us with, that call to curiosity. And if you are feeling up for it or so, to just take a step outside and see what you encounter, see the plants that you encounter, the other living beings, and see if you can open your heart, as we're saying, to having an interaction, and see if we can suspend your judgment for a moment, and see what comes back, see what location in there, and might take you. And I do really believe that, as I said, if more of us are doing that, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to become a green thumb or planting out a garden or whatever, but through acts and energies, large and small, that does make the world a better place. So on that note, thank you so much for engaging with us. We hope you are living a vibrant life that's getting more and more vibrant as we go along. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for tuning in. And we'll catch you out there. Aloha.